This being the first meeting of the year, it's not only the regular council meeting, but it's also the organizational meeting also. First order of business will be the appointment of the pro tem clerk. Do I have a nomination for that? Mr. Whitehill.
Move to appoint Mr. Gall.
Is there a second on that? Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Gall, if you call the roll on that, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Brown? Present. Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Gall, yes. Mr. Knoll?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Here.
I'll vote in the favor, sir.
Oh, yes.
Very good. Mr. Gall, if you would go ahead and call the roll for attendance, please.
Mr. Brown? Present. Mrs. Dickey?
Here.
Mr. Knoll? Present. Mr. Paparotis?
Here.
Mr. Whitehill?
Here.
Mr. Gall, all present, sir.
Very good, thank you. Next matter of business is the adoption of council rules for this year. Everybody had a copy that was placed in their area beforehand. Do I have a motion to adopt the rules governing council?
Are there any changes, Mr. President?
The only thing that was in there was the one dealing that with change we made during the year.
Thank you.
All right, moving then, Mr. Brown, to adopt those?
Yes.
All right, is there a second? Mr. Knoll? Mr. Gall, would you please call the roll?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Brown? Yes. Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Knoll?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Gall, all in the affirmative, sir.
Thank you. Next is the nomination of a candidate for clerk of council. Do I have a nomination for that position? Mr. Whitehill.
Nominate Mrs. Brooker.
All right, is there a second on that? Mr. Brown? Mr. Gall, if you'd please call the roll.
Mr. Brown? Yes. Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Knoll?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Mr. Gall, all in the affirmative, sir.
All right, very good. Mr. Mayor, if you would go ahead and administer the oath to Mrs. Bricker, please.
Repeat after me. I, state the name,
I, Debbie Bricker,
do hereby swear
do hereby swear
or affirm
or affirm
that I will support
that I will support
the Constitution
the Constitution
of the United States of America,
of the United States of America,
the laws
the laws
of the state of Ohio,
of the state of Ohio,
and the ordinances
and the ordinances
of the city of Salem, Ohio.
of the city of Salem, Ohio.
I will faithfully,
I will faithfully,
honestly, and impartially
and impartially
discharge and perform
discharge and perform
my duties
my duties
as council clerk
as council clerk
of the city of Salem
of the city of Salem,
according to the best
according to the best
of my ability
of my ability
and understanding.
and understanding.
Congratulations.
Right, next, we'll move to the appointment of President Pro Tem. Is there any nominations?
I nominate Brian Whitehill.
All right, thank you, Mr. Knoll. Is there a second on that? Mrs. Dickey? Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mrs. Dickey?
Yes.
Mr. Gall?
Yes.
Mr. Knoll?
Yes.
Mr. Paparotis?
Yes.
Mr. Whitehill?
Yes.
Okay.
Congratulations. Next, everybody's received a copy of the minutes from our last meeting in December. Are there any corrections, deletions to those minutes or additions? Seeing none, they'll stand as approved. The committee appointments for 2017, I'll just briefly go over those. For Finance and Appropriations, Mr. Whitehill will be the chairperson. Mr. Knoll and Mr. Gall will be on that committee. Utilities, Mr. Gall will remain as chairman. Mrs. Dickey and whoever the lucky person is that council eventually appoints will be on that committee also. Parks and Recreation, Mr. Paparotis will chair that. Mr. Knoll and Mr. Brown will be on that. Economic Development, Mr. Knoll will be the chairperson. Mr. Paparotis and Mr. Whitehill will also serve on that. Streets, Alleys, and Sidewalk, Mr. Brown will again chair that. Mr. Paparotis, and again the person to be named. And Traffic and Safety, The person to be named will be the chairperson, Mrs. Dickey, and Mr. Whitehill will be on that also. Rules and Ordinance, Mrs. Dickey will chair that. Mr. Brown and Mr. Gall will again serve on that. Committee of the Whole will be Mr. Whitehill as the President Pro Tem. We know the Clerk Pro Tem is going to be Mr. Gall. The liaisons for Perry Township will be Mr. Brown. For Sadik, Mr. Knoll. For the Historical Preservation Society, Mr. Gall. For the Tourism Board, Mr. Paparotis. Shade Tree Commission, Mr. Whitehill. Design Review Board, Mrs. Dickey, and whoever is named will then serve as the school liaison.